Developing this morning, we are learning some new details this morning about the disturbing murder of a woman killed just 3 days after getting engaged.
Shockingly, cops arrested her fiance for the murder. Taisha Walker's in downtown Houston this morning, covering the story live for us. Taisha?
The man accused of killing his fiancée is due in court later this morning. Meanwhile, the family of that victim tells us that she didn't deserve to die, not so soon.
1, 2, 3.
A tribute for a woman gunned down Friday in this very parking lot. Loved ones gathered Sunday to remember 33-year-old Dominique Jefferson, a mother of 3.
She was a caring person, a very caring person. You can get her last.
Prosecutors say this man, Kendrick Akins, is the one who pulled the trigger after the couple got into an argument outside of their Northwest Houston apartment Friday. Jefferson's mother, Tina Hunter, says her daughter seemed happy. She wasn't expecting this news days after the couple's engagement.
He proposed to her New Year's Eve, Facebook Live. I mean, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful proposal. He gave her a ring and did the whole 9 yards, and then turn around 3 days later and kill my daughter. That's not right. That's not right at all.
Akins turned himself in Saturday. He's charged with murder and aggravated assault. He's sitting in jail this morning on a $150,000 bond.
He don't need a bond. My daughter didn't deserve this. He don't deserve to get out. He don't deserve a bond.
Akins is due before a judge at 9 o'clock this morning. We will be there and we'll have updates for you throughout the day on Channel 2 News. For now, reporting live from downtown, I'm Taisha Walker.
They said love was supposed to be her second chance, a fresh start after years of struggle. Her smile lit up every room, and when he dropped to one knee on New Year's Eve, the world seemed to finally give her the fairy tale she deserved. Family members watched live on social media as she said yes. Her mother's tears were tears of joy. Her children clapped and laughed in the background. A promise of forever had just been made, but forever only lasted 72 hours. 3 days later, neighbors in Northwest Houston heard the sound of a single gunshot echoing through the night. A mother of 3 lay bleeding in the parking lot of her own apartment. The man who had promised her love and protection was gone, fleeing into the darkness. Her friends would later ask, how could the same man who placed a ring on her finger pull a trigger aimed at her chest? How could a celebration of love end in a moment of violence so cold? The case shocked a city already plagued by domestic abuse, but this one was different. It was caught in real time, the joy, the promise, the heartbreak. A story that unfolded in front of family, friends, and the thousands who had witnessed their New Year's engagement online. 3 days. That was all it took to turn a dream into a nightmare. Why was Dominic Jefferson killed? And what secrets about her fiancé would emerge when the truth finally came out? Let's find out.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
Her name was Dominic Jefferson, 33 years old, a daughter, a sister, a devoted mother of 3 children who depended on her strength every single day. She lived in Northwest Houston, Texas, in an apartment on Hollyview Drive. It wasn't a neighborhood known for glamour, but it was home, a place where working families tried to build a life despite the city's long struggle with violent crime. Houston, one of the largest cities in America, has consistently ranked near the top in cases of domestic violence and intimate partner homicides. For many families here, those statistics are not just numbers, they are reality. In Dominic's case, would become one of the most painful reminders of how quickly a household can turn into a crime scene. On the evening of January 4th, 2020, just 4 days into the new year, police dispatchers received an emergency call from Hollyview Drive. A woman had been shot. Neighbors reported hearing an argument before the sound of a single gunshot shattered the night. By the time officers arrived, they found Dominic Jefferson on the ground. She had been shot once in the chest, the bullet fired from only a few feet away. First responders rushed to save her, but the wound was too devastating. Dominic would not survive. What began as a joyous celebration of love just days earlier had turned into a homicide investigation. Detectives on scene immediately faced the central question. How did this happen, and who pulled the trigger? That mystery, however, would not remain unsolved for long. To understand the weight of this tragedy, you have to understand who Dominic Jefferson truly was. Dominic wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was born and raised in Texas, a woman shaped by both hardship and resilience. Friends described her as the kind of person who carried light with her, the one who could make others laugh even on their worst days. Her smile was wide, genuine, the kind that made you believe she could handle anything life threw at her. She was a mother of three young children who were her world. Every decision, every sacrifice she made was with them in mind. She balanced work, parenting, and the constant struggle of keeping a household together. Those close to her said she never put herself first. It was always about her kids. They were her motivation, her reason to fight through long nights and early mornings. Family members recalled how Dominic's home was always filled with noise. Children's laughter, music playing in the background, the occasional chaos of a busy household. But beneath it all was her steady hand, her determination to give her children stability even when the odds weren't in her favor. She had dreams, too. Dreams of one day building something bigger for her family. A small business of her own. A better house. A life where she wouldn't have to worry if she could afford the next school supply list or medical bill. People who knew her say she deserved it all because she never stopped giving, never stopped pushing forward. On social media, Dominic presented herself as fun-loving and hopeful. Her posts often spoke about love, about faith, about wanting the kind of happiness that lasts. She wasn't flashy, but she had an energy that made people pay attention. Those who knew her personally called her Dom, a nickname said with affection because that was how people felt around her, connected. She was the type of woman who drew people in, who made you feel like you mattered. Her friends often said she carried a mix of softness and strength, gentle enough to comfort, but fierce enough to defend herself and those she loved. She had lived through heartbreak before, and like many women her age, she was searching for someone who would truly value her, someone who would love her the way she loved others. For Dominic Jefferson, that search seemed to end when she met Kendrick Akins. At first glance, he looked like the answer to her prayers, the man who would take away the weight she carried alone, someone who could give her the stability and partnership she longed for. But no one knew then that the man who walked into her life with promises of forever was carrying a history darker than anyone could have imagined. When Dominic first crossed paths with Kendrick Akins, she wasn't looking for chaos. She wanted love, stability, and the kind of partnership that would finally make her feel safe. Kendrick, with his easy smile and confident presence, seemed to offer just that. To friends, the romance moved quickly. Within just a few months of dating, Dominic was showing him off, bringing him into her world, and allowing him into the most vulnerable parts of her life. The man who stood beside her looked like the dream she had always imagined. A partner who promised commitment, who whispered about building a future, who told her she deserved the world. Their relationship wasn't private. It unfolded on social media for everyone to see. Posts and photos captured him holding her close, comments filled with promises of loyalty and devotion. To outsiders, it looked like a whirlwind romance that was destined for a fairy tale ending. But beneath the smiling photos and romantic captions, there were cracks. Friends later recalled the tension in Dominic's voice when she spoke of him, the unease in her eyes when certain subjects came up. It was as if she wanted desperately to believe in the love she was being offered, but something inside her questioned whether it was real. Still, when New Year's Eve arrived, Kendrick staged the moment she thought she'd always wanted. In front of family, friends, and an audience watching through a Facebook live stream, he dropped to one knee and asked Dominic to be his wife. The video captured the excitement, the cheers, the tears, her children laughing in the background. For a brief moment, the story seemed perfect. The kind of proposal every woman dreams of, sealed with a ring and the promise of forever. But there was another side to Kendrick Akins, one that wasn't visible in that carefully curated moment. He carried a past of violence, a history of anger, in a pattern of control that stretched back years. At the time, most people didn't know about the domestic abuse convictions in his record. They didn't know he had already been accused of pointing a gun at another woman. They didn't know he was a man who had learned to hide his darkness behind charm. And Dominic, blinded by the hope of love and a new chapter, couldn't have known that saying yes to his proposal would set in motion the final, tragic chapter of her life. The morning of January 4th, 2020, began like any other Saturday. For Dominic, it was a day spent at home with her children and close friends, the kind of day where everyday responsibilities blended with the simple comforts of family life. But behind the ordinary rhythm of that morning, the tension in her relationship with Kendrick Akins was quietly building. The two had argued before, but this argument felt heavier. It began with a message, a simple post on social media that Dominic saw, something that suggested Kendrick's attention was drifting elsewhere. For a woman who had only just accepted his proposal days earlier, the discovery cut deep. The ring on her finger had barely settled in, and already her trust was being tested. By the early afternoon, words had turned sharp. Dominic confronted him, and Kendrick, known for his temper, did not take it lightly. Friends would later recall how Dominic sounded when she spoke to them that day. Tired, frustrated, but also determined. She told one of them she had called off the engagement. She was done. As evening fell, Dominic prepared to leave the apartment she shared with Kendrick. She wasn't alone. A close friend was with her, standing by her side as she gathered her things. They moved quickly, as if rushing against an unseen clock. For Dominic, this wasn't just about leaving an apartment. It was about reclaiming her peace. The plan was simple. Get into her car, drive away, and put distance between herself and the man who had already caused her so much pain in so little time. But fate had other plans. When she turned the key in the ignition, the engine failed. The car refused to start. That's when Kendrick appeared, stepping outside, acting as though he intended to help. He leaned under the hood, fiddling with the car's engine. But his presence only escalated the tension. Dominic's voice rose as she demanded that he step away, to leave her in the car alone. Witnesses would later describe the sharpness in her tone, not just anger, but desperation. She wanted him gone. The argument intensified in the chill of the January night. Her friend urged her to calm down, to focus, but Dominic was firm. She had made her choice. She wasn't going back on it. And then, in a single moment, the night turned fatal. As Dominic shouted at him to step away, Kendrick pulled a handgun from his pocket. The distance between them was no more than a few feet, close enough that there was no mistaking his intent. He raised the weapon, aimed at her chest, and fired once. The sound echoed through the apartment complex parking lot, a sound that neighbors would never forget. Dominic staggered, clutching her chest, and collapsed to the ground beside the car that had betrayed her. Her friend screamed, rushing to her side, but there was nothing anyone could do. The wound was catastrophic, the shot fired at point-blank range. Kendrick didn't stay. He didn't call for help. Instead, he turned the gun toward the friend who had stood by Dominic, firing a shot that narrowly missed. And then, without a word, he snatched Dominic's phone, as if to silence her even in death, and fled into the darkness. It had taken less than a minute. One argument, one bullet, a life extinguished. From the moment she confronted him to the instant he pulled the trigger, the clock on Dominic's future had been ticking. In less than 72 hours, she had gone from hopeful bride-to-be to a victim whose children would never see her again. And as neighbors called 911 and sirens began to pierce the night, Kendrick Akins disappeared into the city, leaving behind the wreckage of a love story that had turned into a crime scene. The first officer rolled in with lights washing the brick walls blue and red, the kind of glare that makes an ordinary parking lot feel like a stage. A woman was already on her knees beside Dominic, hands trembling, voice hoarse from shouting for help. The hood of Dominic's car stood open like a warning. A single casing glinted near the front tire. Paramedics moved in fast. One cut through fabric. Another pressed gloved hands where blood spread warm against the night air. The monitor stuttered out its flat logic while they worked with urgency that bordered on defiance. Neighbors clustered at a careful distance, arms wrapped around themselves, whispering names and fragments. Who lived where? Who saw what? Who ran? The friend spoke through shock, sentences breaking, then gathering again. She pointed to the open hood. She pointed to the direction he fled. She tried to hand over a phone that wasn't there. Officers wrote it down exactly as she said it. The argument, the demand to leave, the single shot, the second round aimed her way. One officer slid an evidence marker beside the casing. Another photographed the streaks on the pavement, the spread of light from a security lamp on the far pole, the ring still on Dominic's finger catching the ambulance glow. They followed the trail of details that scenes like this always leave behind. The position of her body relative to the bumper. The way the driver door hung half ajar. The small things that don't make headlines but matter later. Footprints pressed in a grit, a faint scuff on the asphalt where someone pivoted hard, the constellation of red dots where hands had tried to help. Command arrived, and the perimeter widened. Yellow tape traced a border around what minutes earlier had been nothing more than a place to park. Names were taken, IDs checked. An officer went apartment to apartment, knocking softly at first, then firmer, asking who heard the argument, who stepped outside, who saw a man leave in a hurry, and in which direction. Every account was pinned to time. The exact minute someone checked a clock, the precise second a child asked what the noise was. The radio carried updates in clipped phrases. Unit clearing stairwells, unit canvassing for exterior cameras, unit securing the east exit. A detective crouched by the open hood, noting the tools, the angle of the prop, the cold metal under his palm. Another stood back and traced the line from where the casing lay to where the body had fallen to the corridor, where the friend said the muzzle turned and flashed. In the midst of procedure, quiet settled in brief pockets. The kind of quiet that acknowledges what the uniforms already knew from the first look at the wound. A paramedic's voice lowered. Heads nodded once, slowly. A blanket appeared, not to warm, but to cover. The friend pressed a hand to her mouth and shook, shoulders heaving soundlessly now. Across the tape, someone spoke Dominic's name, then said she has kids, and the words hung there. An officer wrote that down too, because everything goes into the record. Another officer asked the friend again about the missing phone, about the clothes he wore, about which pocket his hand went to before the shot. The answers were steadying now, the way truth can sharpen when grief has no more air to burn. Before the scene was released, they did the last of the slow work. More photographs, measurements from bumper to casing, casing to curb. A flashlight beam crawling along concrete until it found a second small piece of brass pressed near a crack. Spent, just as the friend had said. A map sketched in a notebook, positions, arrows, the arc of flight. Then the coroner's van eased in, and the tape bowed as it passed. An officer stood at the edge of the lot and watched the taillights drift away down Hollyview Drive, the night swallowing what it could. Behind him, the markers and chalk would wash away with the next rain. But the notes, the statements, the coordinates of Payne's said in ink, those would travel with the case toward the questions that scenes like this demand. Who pulled the trigger and why? Detectives knew from the very first hour that this was not going to be a mystery about who pulled the trigger. The witnesses were clear, the descriptions precise. What they needed now was a complete picture, the why, the history, and the trail of violence that led to this moment. By dawn the next morning, officers were already knocking on doors beyond the immediate apartment complex. They wanted to know where Kendrick Akins had gone after he fled. They traced his path across intersections, checked traffic cameras, and pulled footage from nearby businesses. Every sighting, every glimpse of a man walking quickly with a heavy stride was cataloged. The friend who had been at Dominic's side gave a detailed statement at the station. She described the argument, the flash of metal, the deafening crack that followed. Her voice broke as she explained how he turned the gun on her, how she believed for a split second she would die as well. Investigators reassured her, but they also pressed for accuracy, because every word would matter when it reached a courtroom. Meanwhile, a different team began digging into Kendrick's background. What they uncovered was not just a list of petty offenses, but a dark and violent record stretching back nearly 2 decades. In 2008, There had been an assault charge against a former partner, a case that revealed his temper was more than a rumor. In 2015, he was caught with methamphetamine and a firearm he wasn't supposed to have as a convicted felon. He had been in and out of the system, each incident leaving behind paperwork that painted the same picture. A man who mixed charm with control, who escalated quickly from words to violence. And then there were the chilling stories. A woman came forward to say Kendrick had once placed a loaded shotgun to her head while she slept and pulled the trigger. The weapon misfired, sparing her life by nothing more than chance. Prosecutors would later repeat this detail to the jury, underscoring that Dominic's murder was not a single, tragic mistake, but part of a pattern that had been escalating for years. Investigators considered other theories in those early days. Could jealousy have been the motive? Had the proposal and its sudden unraveling pushed him into rage? Or had Dominic's decision to walk away threatened his control in a way he couldn't tolerate? Each theory circled back to the same conclusion. This was not about robbery, not about chance, but about power. Kendrick Akins had decided that if he could not keep Dominic on his terms, he would not allow her to leave on hers. The community whispered their own suspicions. Some wondered if Dominic had seen warning signs too late. Others asked why a man with such a violent past had been free at all, still able to carry a gun despite his record. Theories swirled in living rooms, at vigils, on social media threads, where Dominic's smiling face appeared beside words of mourning and anger. For detectives, the case file was filling fast. Eyewitness testimony, ballistic evidence, criminal history, and a suspect still at large. But they didn't have to wait long. Within 12 hours of the shooting, Kendrick Akins walked into a Houston police station and turned himself in. He said little. He offered no explanations, but his surrender confirmed what investigators already knew. The story of Dominic Jefferson's final hours was about to collide with a courtroom, and every disturbing chapter of his past would come into play. For Dominic's family, the hours after her death were not measured in clocks or calendars. They were measured in the weight of silence where her voice should have been, in the faces of her 3 children who no longer had a mother to tuck them in at night. Her mother was the first to speak publicly. Just days earlier, she had watched her daughter's proposal on Facebook Live, tears of joy streaming as she saw her daughter say yes to what she believed was a new beginning. Now those same tears were salted with grief. Standing before cameras at a vigil, she asked the question no mother should ever have to ask. How could a promise of love turn into a gunshot so soon? Her siblings described Dominic as the glue that held their family together. One of them recalled how Dominic never ended a phone call without saying, "I love you." Now those words echoed in their memory, a reminder that her warmth was gone. Friends joined in, telling stories of a woman who could dance in the kitchen with her children one moment and fiercely defend them the next. They painted a portrait of someone who had given her all to the people she loved, only to have her life stolen in a moment of selfish rage. The vigils became a ritual of both mourning and defiance. Hundreds gathered with candles flickering against the Texas night sky. Posters with Dominic's smile leaned against railings. Balloons floated upward, released in her honor, carrying with them prayers whispered by children and cries shouted by adults demanding justice. The chants mixed with sobs. Her life mattered. Her children clung to relatives, their small hands gripping tightly, as if afraid the world might take someone else from them. For them, the loss was not a headline or a courtroom story. It was the absence of a mother's embrace, the empty chair at school events, the silence in the car where her laughter once played through the speakers. Even the wider community felt the blow. Women who had never met Dominic spoke at vigils, admitting they saw themselves in her. Women who had endured abusive relationships. Women who had ignored red flags out of hope for love. Women who knew that her story could just as easily have been theirs. The family's voice was not just grief, it was a call. A call for the system to pay attention to the warning signs of abusers. A call for neighbors to step in when they see danger. For friends not to stay silent when someone they love is at risk. They spoke Dominic's name not just to mourn her, but to make sure she wasn't reduced to just another statistic in Houston's domestic violence records. At her funeral, the final goodbyes were heavy. Her mother kissed her forehead one last time. Her siblings whispered promises to care for her children. And the community stood together, vowing that her story would not be forgotten, even as the trial loomed on the horizon. For Dominic's family, the fight for justice was no longer about Kendrick Akins alone. It was about ensuring that her children grew up knowing their mother's life had meaning, that her death was not in vain, and that her voice, though silenced by violence, would continue to echo through theirs. Nearly 3 years after that January night, the story of Dominic Jefferson's death shifted from police reports and vigils to the solemn walls of a Harris County courtroom. For her family, it was the moment they had waited for. The day Kendrick Akins would finally be forced to face the truth he had spent years running from. The courtroom itself carried the heavy air of tension. Wooden benches filled with family members, reporters, and curious onlookers. At the front, Dominic's mother sat with her hands folded tightly, clutching tissues already damp with tears. Beside her were Dominic's siblings, their eyes fixed on the man who once promised to be part of their family. When Kendrick Akins was led in, he wore the expression of a man who had lived this routine before. The jumpsuit, the shackles, the stillness of a defendant trying to appear calm. But beneath that facade, jurors would soon learn, was a history that told another story entirely. Prosecutors began with Dominic's final hours, guiding the jury step by step through the timeline. They played the 911 calls, letting the jury hear the panic in the friend's voice as she described the gunshot. They displayed photographs of the parking lot, each image tagged with evidence markers, each detail reminding jurors of the brutal simplicity of what had happened. A man aimed at the woman he claimed to love, and he fired. Then came the history. The prosecutors carefully laid out Akins' record, the assault of a family member years earlier, the drug charges, the gun possession, the parole violations. But the most chilling testimony was the revelation of what he had once admitted, holding a shotgun to a woman's head while she slept, pulling the trigger, and the weapon not firing. That single detail shifted the energy in the room. It was no longer just about one act of violence. It was about a man who had lived with violence as part of his nature. Witness after witness spoke, some through tears, others with measured resolve. The friend who had been there the night of the shooting told the jury about the argument, the way Dominic's voice rose the moment the gun appeared. Her words cracked, but never wavered. The courtroom leaned into her testimony, hearing the fear she still carried. The defense tried to soften the picture, suggesting that emotions had run high, that the shot was not premeditated but a tragic loss of control. But the evidence, the prior acts, and the pattern of escalation spoke louder than any attempt at mitigation. Then came the verdict. On October 21st, 2022, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the word everyone in the room had been waiting to hear: guilty. As the foreperson read it aloud, Kendrick Akins collapsed. His body jerked, his face drained of color, and within seconds the courtroom was thrown into chaos. Deputies rushed forward, medics were called, and the man who had silenced Dominic with one pull of a trigger now lay silent himself on the floor, seizing. The judge had no choice but to postpone the sentencing. For Dominic's family, it was another cruel delay. Justice had been declared, but closure would have to wait. Days later, the court reconvened. The jury listened again, this time not to witnesses of the crime, but to testimony about Akins' violent past, the trail of abuse that had led inevitably to this outcome. And when the final decision was announced, the weight of it filled the room. Life in prison, a designation as a habitual offender. A man who had built a legacy of violence would spend the rest of his life behind bars. District Attorney Kim Ogg's words echoed after sentencing. This man was an abuser with a string of domestic violence crimes that continued to escalate until he killed a woman. Unfortunately, Dominique Jefferson lost her life because he lost his temper. For Dominic's family, the sentence was not a victory. Nothing could return her to them. Nothing could undo the image of her lying in that parking lot. But it was at last accountability. And as they left the courtroom, they carried with them the knowledge that her story had been heard, her voice honored, and her children spared the sight of the man who destroyed their family ever walking free again. Dominic Jefferson's story is more than a tragedy. It is a warning. A mother of three, a woman full of hope, who believed in love until the very end, silenced by the man who promised her forever. Her children will grow up without her. Her family will carry a wound that never truly heals, and her community will never forget the light that was stolen from them. Her case reminds us that violence often hides behind a smile, behind promises, behind the illusion of love. And it shows us how quickly control can turn deadly when red flags are ignored. If you're watching this, remember her name, remember her life, and remember that speaking up, listening, and acting early can save lives. For Dominic, and for every victim whose story never made the news, we owe it to them not to look away. If this story moved you, don't just leave in silence. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so her story is never forgotten. Leave a comment with your thoughts, because conversations like this matter. Together, we can make sure Dominic's voice still echoes, even in her absence.